Eli Bishop rose with the sun. He always did, even though there was no job to clock into anymore, no children to wake for school, no wife beside him to complain that the birds started chirping too early. He lived alone, in a creaking farmhouse on the edge of town, and kept a life carved from habit. He moved slowly but purposefully, as if every motion had once mattered more than it did now. He boiled water for coffee on the stovetop, poured it into the same chipped mug, and sat on the porch for exactly 8 minutes. He watched the fog lift off the grass and disappear into the trees, and when the time felt right, never checked by a clock, he rose, stretched his back, and grabbed the small toolbox that waited beside the door. The walk to the fence took him 5 minutes, not 4, not 6. The path was worn into the grass, not from the footsteps of others, but from his own boots treading the same ground daily for the past 7 years. The house, once painted white, now peeled in strips like sunburned skin. The fields beyond the fence had gone to seed, a wild tangle of weeds and forgotten crops. But the fence, well, the fence was always maintained. More precisely, one board, the same one, always the same one. It was the third plank from the corner post, right where the fence turned toward the old oak tree that loomed just past the boundary of Eli's land. Every morning, the board hung loose, dangling at a crooked angle, and every morning, Eli nailed it back into place. He never told anyone why he kept doing it. The townspeople noticed, of course. It wasn't a big town. Kids biking past the property would joke that Old Man Bishop had lost his mind, fixing a fence that didn't stay fixed. Adults said he was eccentric, maybe even haunted, but they let him be. No one really wanted to know why Eli Bishop did what he did. In small towns, some questions are better left unasked. Eli himself said very little. He went to the hardware store twice a month to buy nails and boards, though he never needed a whole new board. He kept his purchases small, his interactions shorter. No one pressed. He was polite, quiet, and paid in cash. Sometimes he'd pause at the fence after hammering the last nail in, just stand there and look out toward the woods like he was waiting. For what? No one knew. Maybe not even Eli. He never ventured beyond the fence. He didn't hunt or hike or picnic. He didn't even mow beyond the boundary. The grass on his side was kept short and neat. The other side was wild, as if the land itself refused to be tamed once past the point he allowed himself to touch. People used to say the land back there was cursed. Eli didn't argue. He just kept fixing that board. One morning, he stayed a little longer than usual. A wind was moving through the trees, not sharp or cold, just enough to stir the leaves into whispers. He stood with one hand resting on the fence post, head tilted as if listening. Something was different. He couldn't name it. It was like the silence had shifted, like the stillness wasn't just stillness anymore, but something watching. But he said nothing, just turned, toolbox in hand, and walked back the way he came. That evening, he sat on the porch again, not with coffee, but with a tumbler of whiskey. He watched the stars come out one by one, eyes tracking something only he could see. The woods were a dark wall beyond the fields, and for the first time in a long while, Eli didn't look away. The next morning, the board was loose again, just as expected. As always, he went through the motions, walked the path, opened the box, pulled out a nail, lined up the plank. But something caught his eye. There, tucked just behind the board, was a small folded piece of paper. He froze. The hammer hovered in the air. His breath hitched in a way it hadn't in years. It was the first time anything had changed in 7 summers, and Eli Bishop wasn't ready. Certainly. Here is an expanded version of Chapter 2 without any headings, continuing the story from Chapter 1 and diving deep into Eli's discovery and inner world. The wind was sharp that morning. Not cold exactly, just restless. It moved through the trees with more purpose than usual, rustling the leaves in short, shivery bursts, making the tall grass ripple like something alive. Eli felt it the moment he stepped outside. It pushed against his chest as if trying to keep him in the house, and for the first time in years, he hesitated on the porch. He stood there for a few seconds longer than usual, his toolbox in one hand, the other wrapped around his coffee mug, now empty. His eyes traveled the distance from his boots to the field, to the fence just visible at the edge of the property. The third plank from the corner post would be loose again. He knew this before he saw it. It always was. But today, the air felt different, like the silence had teeth. Still, routine was routine. He put the mug down on the step, adjusted his grip on the toolbox, and stepped off the porch. The grass was damp, clinging to his pant legs, but he paid it no mind. His boots knew the way. He walked slowly, shoulders stiff, gaze focused. The wind followed him. When he reached the fence, he dropped to one knee like always and set the box down beside him. The wood creaked softly under his fingers. He ran a hand over the familiar plank, the third one down from the post, just above the patch of moss that had started to grow underneath. The board was loose again, same as it had been every morning for 7 years. But this time, it wasn't just loose. It was wedged. Eli frowned. The nail he had driven in the morning before had been pushed partway out, not pulled, not rotted, forced, deliberately. He narrowed his eyes. Something glinted between the gap where the board hung crookedly. Paper, folded and tucked behind the slat. He reached for it slowly, like it might vanish if he moved too quickly. His fingertips brushed the edge of the paper, stiff from the cold, and carefully pulled it free. It was a scrap of notebook paper, frayed at the edges and folded 3 times. He stared at it for a long moment, thumb brushing against the fold line. A part of him didn't want to open it. A bigger part knew he had to. His hand trembled just slightly as he unfolded the paper. 5 words, written in pencil, child's handwriting, uneven, slanted. I know what you did. The air left Eli's lungs as if someone had struck him in the chest. He blinked. Once, twice, then read it again. The message didn't change. He stood up too fast, the creak in his knees drowned out by the sudden rush of blood in his ears. The wind picked up again, whistling through the trees like a warning. Eli turned in a slow circle, scanning the field, the tree line, even the space behind him toward the house. Empty, quiet, still. But it didn't feel empty. He folded the note back up and slipped it into the front pocket of his flannel shirt. Then, almost mechanically, he picked up his hammer and drove the nail back into the board, sealing the plank shut. He didn't pause afterward like he normally did. He didn't lean on the post or stare out into the woods. He just picked up his box and walked back the way he came, a little faster than usual, his steps just a bit uneven. Back inside the house, the rooms felt colder. He shut the door, locked it, something he never did during the day, and moved straight to the kitchen. He stood at the counter, staring out the window, the note still burning in his pocket. The coffee mug from that morning sat on the sink. He didn't touch it. What disturbed him wasn't just the message. It was the handwriting. Small, young. A child's hand. Maybe no older than 9 or 10. And he knew there hadn't been children near his land in years. Not since... No, he wouldn't go there. Not yet. He went to the small desk in the hallway, the one he rarely opened, and pulled out an old envelope, yellowed at the corners. Inside were a few papers he hadn't looked at in a long time. Records, maps, the deed to the property, a black and white photo of the land before the fence went up. He dug until he found what he didn't want to find. A report. Faded typewritten text, with a name at the top he didn't like to see. He stared at it for a moment before shoving the whole stack back in the drawer. That night, he didn't sit on the porch. He stayed indoors, shades drawn, lights off, the house filled with nothing but the tick of the old wall clock. He sat in the kitchen chair, note unfolded before him on the table, reading the words over and over, as if they might change, as if they might explain themselves. I know what you did. How could they know? Who had been watching? And why now, after all these years? At one point, he went to the front door and peeked out through the gap in the curtains. The field lay quiet under the stars. The fence stood just visible in the moonlight, a jagged silhouette at the edge of his world. And for just a moment, just 1 second, he thought he saw movement near the fence, something small, a flicker of red, then gone. Eli closed the curtain and backed away. He didn't sleep that night, and for the first time in 7 years, he began to wonder if fixing that fence had ever really kept anything out. Certainly. Here is an expanded, continuous version of Chapter 3, told with rich detail and internal depth, continuing Eli's story without headings or interruptions. Eli didn't go out the next morning. For the first time in over 7 years, the path from the porch to the fence remained untouched. The toolbox sat by the door, just as he'd left it the day before, and the coffee stayed in the mug longer than it usually did. He held it, cold now, with both hands, elbows resting on the kitchen table as he stared at the folded note lying open before him. He'd placed it there again, flattening the creases as if trying to iron clarity into the message. The pencil was already beginning to fade in places, smudged slightly from where his thumb had pressed against it. But the words hadn't changed. They still stared back at him in that shaky, slanted hand. I know what you did. He'd memorized the shape of each letter, the odd way the K looped backward, the overly long tail on the D. A child's hand, no doubt in his mind. Not someone mocking a child, not a forgery. A real one. Which left him with the impossible question, whose hand? The obvious answer sat like a stone in his chest, but he refused to touch it. Not yet. Instead, he sat in silence, the whole house still around him, as if waiting. He reached once toward the window, then pulled back his hand. He didn't want to look out at the fence today. Didn't want to see if the board had come loose again. If it had, it meant the pattern continued. Something was keeping it open, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know what. But by midday, the weight became unbearable. He stood, slow and stiff, and walked to the hallway closet where an old coat hung. It still smelled faintly of cedar and ash. He reached into one of the deep pockets and pulled out a small brass key on a string. His hand hovered there a moment before he closed his fist around it and made his way to the back room. The door hadn't been opened in years. It stuck at first, the wood swollen in the frame, but eventually gave with a sharp crack and a groan. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a slit of sunlight pushing through warped blinds. Dust floated in the air, thick and lazy. The walls were lined with boxes, some labeled in black marker. Tools, photos, books, Amelia's things. He bypassed them all. In the far corner, half covered with an old quilt, stood a low wooden chest. The lock was old, but well oiled. Eli knelt, inserted the key, and turned. The click echoed through the quiet house. Inside were bundles of paper, old photos, and one item that made his throat tighten. A child's red mitten. Faded now, frayed at the edge. He held it in his hands for a long time, staring at the tiny shape of it. Then he reached underneath the lining and pulled out the real reason he'd come. A folder. Thick, yellowed, the kind used by police or lawyers. He didn't need to open it to remember what it contained, but he did anyway. The top sheet was a missing person report. The name at the top. Anna Grace Holloway. Age 9. Last seen, August 13th, 2007. Last known location, the edge of the Holloway property, bordering Eli Bishop's land. Eli stared at the document until the words blurred, then set it aside and pulled out the second item, a photograph. Black and white, low resolution, taken by a helicopter the day after the search began. It showed the line of trees that marked the start of the woods, and faintly, just barely visible, a path cutting through the grass that led from the Holloway's back field to the boundary fence. His fence. He could still hear the voices from that day. Shouts in the woods, the barking of search dogs, the drone of the helicopter circling overhead. He remembered standing on his porch with a deputy, answering questions with a voice that shook less than his hands. Yes, he'd seen her before. No, not recently. Yes, she liked to play near the fence. No, he hadn't heard or seen anything unusual. But he had. He'd heard the scream. It was faint, distant, easily mistakable for a bird or the wind if you weren't paying attention. But Eli was always paying attention. That scream had split the air and stopped his breath, and for a moment, just one frozen moment, he had stared toward the woods and done nothing. He had told himself she would be fine, that she'd fallen, that someone would find her, that it wasn't his place to go trampling through the woods chasing noises he couldn't explain. He didn't go after her. And the next morning, when the board came loose for the first time, he hammered it back in place. Every day after that, it came loose again. Every morning, he repaired it. It became penance, routine, a silent prayer for forgiveness. But it had never brought peace. Not really, only stillness. And now, someone knew. He closed the folder and stood, fingers tightening around the worn edges. His legs ached. His back popped as he straightened, the room seeming colder than before. He stepped out into the hallway, back into the light, blinking hard. Outside, the wind had returned. Not angry, but insistent, like it was reminding him that time was moving again. He went to the front window and slowly peeled back the curtain. The field looked normal, nothing out of place. The grass danced, the trees swayed. The fence stood quiet in the distance. But something was there. Near the base of the third plank, half hidden in the grass, was a shape. Small, round, bright red. Eli's breath caught. He pressed his hand to the glass. A child's mitten. The other one. He didn't remember crossing the porch. Didn't recall grabbing his coat or boots. One moment he was staring out the window. The next, he was standing at the edge of the fence, heart pounding, wind cutting through his coat, eyes locked on the crimson scrap of wool resting on the dirt. It was identical to the one in his chest, same size, same worn threads, and yet he hadn't seen it in nearly 2 decades. He bent down slowly, picked it up. The fabric was warm. That was impossible. He turned it over. Inside, written in black ink, smudged and nearly invisible, were the same 5 words from the note. "I know what you did." Eli stumbled backward. The wind howled, bending the branches above him. A murder of crows took flight from the trees, scattering into the gray sky with harsh cries. The fence behind him creaked. And without touching it, without wind, without cause, the third board fell loose again. Of course. Here is a fully expanded and immersive version of Chapter 4, continuing the story in rich atmospheric detail. This version flows naturally and does not use any headings or breaks. The girl appeared just after sunset. Eli had returned from the fence shaken and wordless. He hadn't repaired the board that time. He hadn't even tried. The mitten, the second one, now rested on the table beside the note, as if they belonged together, as if someone had meant them to be reunited under his roof. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't try. He sat in the dark for hours, the lights off, the house filled with creaks and distant sighs. At some point, the sky deepened to an inky purple, and the sound of insects replaced the wind. The woods beyond the field stood in stark silhouette, black limbs stretched upward like a frozen crowd mid-prayer. Eli stared through the window with something like dread coiling in his stomach. His hands twitched in his lap. His heart beat in his throat. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced since his younger days, back before the quiet had crept in and smothered everything else. Then, through the grime-streaked glass, something moved. He saw her from the corner of his eye at first, just a flicker of red beyond the fence, barely a blur. He turned his head slowly. There, standing just to the left of the third plank, was a small figure. The coat she wore was unmistakable, bright red, like a cardinal against the gray field, almost glowing in the dark. The hood was pulled up, hiding her face. She stood completely still. Eli didn't breathe. He leaned forward, pressing both hands against the windowsill, his eyes narrowing, heart thundering. The girl didn't move. His first instinct wasn't fear. It was disbelief. It couldn't be her. It wasn't possible. She had been 9 years old in 2007. That was nearly 18 years ago. If she were alive, she'd be an adult now. A woman. But the figure outside wasn't a woman. She was small, slight, a child. Frozen, Eli watched her as the wind rippled through the grass around her but never touched her coat. The branches swayed above her head, but her hood never fluttered. She was part of the scene, and also apart from it, like something cut out of a memory and pasted where it didn't belong. Then suddenly, her head tilted. Not a lot, just enough to suggest acknowledgement. Like she saw him, like she knew. He stepped back instinctively, a sound escaping his lips, a shallow, ragged breath, but he didn't take his eyes off her. Then she moved. She turned away from the fence and walked toward the woods, slow and deliberate. Her feet barely disturbed the tall grass. The red coat bobbed gently as she moved, then vanished behind a thicket of trees. Eli stood still for another full minute, ears ringing. Then he grabbed his coat. He didn't take the flashlight, didn't think to grab his phone. He left the door swinging behind him, boots hitting the porch hard as he strode across the field. The fence loomed ahead like a gate he'd long sworn not to cross. But tonight, he crossed it without thinking. The board hung loose, just as it had that morning. He stepped over it. Beyond the fence, the air felt different, cooler, heavier. The grass was wild, taller than he remembered, brushing against his knees as he walked. The moon offered little light beneath the canopy of the trees, but he moved like he knew the way. Because he did. Years ago, before the guilt, before the silence, he'd walked this trail more times than he could count. There had been a footpath here, once, not marked on any map, not even known to most of the locals. But he'd known it. So had the Holloway girl. She used to follow him sometimes, giggling behind a tree, thinking he didn't notice. He'd pretended not to. Now the trail was overgrown, nearly erased, but his boots found their old rhythm. 10 minutes in, he began to see them. Notes. Folded pieces of paper. Pinned to tree trunks with old, rusted nails. Some were white, some yellowing with age. He approached the first one carefully. Opened it. It was the same handwriting. I waited. He moved to the next one. Why didn't you come? Another. Are you sorry yet? The wind picked up again, rattling the branches. His breath came faster now. He stumbled forward, brushing through vines and undergrowth, each step harder than the last. More notes appeared. A dozen, then more, lining the trees like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to something he didn't want to find. And then he saw the tree. It was massive, older than anything else in the woods, its trunk twisted with time and storms. At its base, partially buried in a bed of moss and rotting leaves, was something small, wooden, familiar. A dollhouse. Eli's knees gave as he sank to the ground beside it. He remembered it instantly. He'd seen it in the Holloway's yard once, painted pale blue, little curtains drawn in the windows. Anna had carried it to the fence to show him one day, proud of its miniature kitchen and furniture. He remembered complimenting it, awkwardly, as she babbled about how her father was going to build her a real one. Now here it was, weathered, split at the roof, moss growing out of the door. He reached for it with shaking hands and found another note resting beneath it. Different this time, newer, crisp. He unfolded it. Come find me. There was no name. There didn't need to be. The wind fell still. Then, from deep in the woods, he heard laughter. A child's laughter. It was faint but clear, playful, cruel. He staggered to his feet, turning toward the sound. He took one step, then another. Something cracked behind him. He whirled. There, 20 feet away, just visible in the dark, stood the girl in the red coat. Only now, her hood was down. Her face was pale, and her eyes too wide, too knowing. She said nothing, just smiled. Then she raised one hand and pointed. Eli turned in the direction of her finger. A tree stump sat ahead. Something metal glinted at its base. He moved toward it. Buried halfway in the dirt was the hammer from his toolbox. He hadn't brought it. He hadn't dropped it. It had been placed. Eli knelt, heart hammering, and lifted it free. The handle was warm, as if recently used. Then, carved into the stump, he saw it. Letters etched deep into the bark. AGH Anna Grace Holloway. He stared at the initials, his mouth dry, his breath shallow. The woods around him pulsed with silence. When he turned back, the girl was gone. Only the wind remained. And the hammer in his hand. And the name etched into the wood like a scar that would never heal. Eli didn't move for a long time. Because somewhere in these woods, something had waited. And now, it was waking up. Of course. Here's the fully expanded version of Chapter 5, written as a seamless continuation of the story with rich detail and psychological depth. No headings, no interruptions. Eli didn't remember walking home. His boots were wet with mud. His hands trembled as if the cold had gotten inside his bones. He clutched the hammer the entire way, like a talisman, like it might protect him. It didn't. His thoughts came in fragments, snatches of images, echoes of laughter, the blur of a red coat darting between trees, and the way her eyes had fixed on him, the way she had smiled, not angry, not sad, just knowing. He kept waiting to wake up, waiting for the spell to lift, but the lights from the house appeared through the trees, and the world remained exactly as it was, tilted slightly off its axis. The board on the fence still hung loose, of course. It swayed gently in the night wind, creaking like a slow breath. He didn't bother fixing it. He just stared at it as he passed, like someone walking past a grave. The old screen door banged behind him as he entered the house, and the warmth of the indoors did nothing to shake the chill settling into his chest. He placed the hammer on the table beside the red mitten and the note. It looked wrong there, out of place, like a ghost of something useful. Then he poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and sat at the table, elbows on the wood, his head in his hands. He stayed like that until the sky turned the color of ash and dawn began bleeding into the windows. Sleep did not come. He wouldn't have let it, even if it tried. When the sun rose, he rose with it. Today was not like the others. Today would not be silent. The time for penance had ended. Something had crossed a line, maybe him, maybe her, maybe both. And now there was no going back. He dressed without thinking, the motions automatic. Coat, boots, gloves. He opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and looked out across the field. Everything was quiet. Still. Except for the board. Still loose. Still waiting. But now, he knew what was beneath it. He made his way to the fence with steady steps. Each footfall seemed to echo more loudly than the last. There was no toolbox this time, only a shovel slung over one shoulder. When he reached the board, he didn't even glance at it. He walked past it, turned, and stood facing the post. The ground beneath was slightly raised, not much, but enough, if you knew what you were looking for, and Eli did. He drove the shovel into the dirt. The soil was cold, compacted, reluctant to give. He had to dig deep, breaking through old roots and years of packed earth. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill. His breath came in clouds. He didn't stop. Not once. Not when his shoulder ached. Not when the wind picked up. Not even when a crow landed on the fence post and watched him with a tilted head, silent and still. 6 feet down, the sound changed. A dull thunk, wooden. Eli's breath caught. He dropped to his knees and clawed the rest of the earth away by hand, brushing soil from the surface of an old wooden box. It was no bigger than a crate, weathered, the top sealed with rusted nails and a strip of red ribbon, faded to pink. He hadn't remembered the ribbon. That part unnerved him more than anything else. Hands trembling, he pried the nails out, one by one. The final one snapped in half, and the lid came loose with a creak. Inside was a small collection of objects: a broken doll's head, a hairbrush, a flashlight that no longer worked, a child's notebook, its pages swollen and warped from moisture, and at the bottom, a folded jacket. Red. It was hers. The truth hit him like a blow. She had never been buried there, not her body, just what was left behind, just the things no one had found, the things he had hidden years ago, when panic had eclipsed reason, when silence had seemed like mercy. Because Eli had found the jacket the morning after the scream, near the base of the fence, just inside the woods, muddy, torn. He hadn't told anyone, not the police, not the Holloways. He had hidden it, believing he was protecting someone, maybe himself, maybe them. He'd told himself it was a child's prank gone too far, that the girl had run away, that she'd come back. But she never did. And the jacket had sat in the earth ever since, like a locked door that no one dared open. Until now. He sat back on his heels and stared at the box. A sound behind him made him freeze. Footsteps in the grass. Light. Soft. Measured. He didn't turn around right away. He already knew who it would be. When he finally stood and turned, the girl was there. Not a ghost. Not exactly. She stood solidly in the field, no longer by the fence, but closer. Her coat was clean, bright. Her hair hung in 2 neat braids. Her eyes, gray-blue, too big for her face, watched him without blinking. Eli opened his mouth, but no words came. She tilted her head again, just as she had in the woods. This time, she spoke. "Now you remember." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, a fact, an invitation. He nodded slowly. His throat ached. He couldn't meet her eyes. "I tried to forget," he said, the words rasping out. She didn't respond, only looked past him, toward the hole he'd dug, toward the box. He followed her gaze. "I thought I was helping," he said. I didn't want to make it worse." A wind moved between them, gentle. The girl stepped closer. "You already did," she said softly. And then, she smiled, not the eerie grin from before, a softer one, sad. "Now you can fix it." Eli's eyes stung. He looked down at his hands, dirt-caked, old, shaking. "How?" But the field was empty again. She was gone. Only the wind remained, and the crows, and the gaping mouth of the earth at his feet. That afternoon he called the sheriff's office. He told them everything. About the night she vanished. About the scream. About the jacket. about the years of silence, about the ritual of the fence. He didn't hold anything back. They came with cameras and questions and tape. They took the box. They took the note. They took the red mitten. And Eli Bishop sat quietly on his porch while they worked, his coffee growing cold beside him. When the sun dipped behind the trees and the last of the police cars pulled away, he walked out to the fence. The board still hung loose. He picked it up, and this time he didn't fix it. He carried it inside the house, set it down, and closed the door. Outside, in the distance, wind moved through the trees. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a red coat fluttered once, then was gone. And the fence finally stayed broken.